Hemel Hempstead, where the explosions took place this morning just after 6. That cloud, that smoke is now spreading right over East London. Our weather presenter Dan Corbett explaining that that ultimately is going to blow out over mainland Europe. But tonight, it's likely to actually stop, and due to the inversion will settle probably somewhere over the southeast of the country. These are some pictures taken by the helicopter a little earlier on, and you can see now that the fuel at the Buncefield depot is still burning. These pictures were taken about 5 minutes ago. No end in sight really for that fire at the moment, and the police and fire services are saying that that could well burn for a couple of days at least. Let's just take you to the M1 quickly as well, just where you can see that the flames are still licking around the site of the oil tanks where that explosion happened at 6:03 this morning, a series of explosions, and you just get an idea of quite how much smoke is still rising into the atmosphere here. And I think just if we can go back to that helicopter shot again now, you see that that smoke is spreading right across the southeast, a thick, dense black smoke from the fuel. Let's speak to Jeff Daniels, who joins me in the studio. He's an engineer and expert on the fuel industry, as we stay with these pictures still from our helicopter live now heading over central London. And Jeff, what sort of quantities of fuel are we talking about here for it still to be burning now, what, 7-8 hours after the original explosion?
Well, I think, Tim, it's probably a case of it's only just started. The Buncefield terminal, it is just an oil storage depot, it's not a refinery, but it's got a reported capacity of about 150,000 tonnes, which is an awful lot of gallons if you care to multiply it out. There's enough fuel there, even assuming that only half the tanks were full or all the tanks were half full. There's enough fuel there to feed this fire for days to come.
We've seen pictures of fire teams hosing down the nearby tanks. I mean, one would presume that the temperature there is so high that it could easily trigger other explosions.
It could indeed. The problem with a fire like this is that you can't put it out, you can only contain it, and the first thing you have to do is, if there are tanks that are still intact but at risk, you've got to try and keep those cool at all costs, otherwise they'll blow as well.
You understand how obviously these fuel depots work. Just looking at some of the reports coming out of Buncefield, it seems that there is a pipeline there as well. Just explain what the immediate first response will be to an explosion like this. Will people be in there just shutting down fuel supplies, linking up the other tanks and pipelines?
There won't be anybody in there at the moment. This site is highly automated. I gather there were actually only 2 people on duty when the blow came. Everything is done by remote control from outside, but certainly they will be trying to shut down the links between tanks, to empty the tanks that are still intact, to cut down the amount of fuel that's available to feed the fire, and of course to stop pipeline feeds from outside from putting any more fuel on site.
So really a tricky job when it comes to containing a fire like this, or will there be just a well-rehearsed procedure? I mean, I just as an expert, I'm interested to know what you think about the fact that firefighters are quite as close as they are at the moment. I mean, when you see what they're hosing down, maybe only 300-400 metres away from the actual explosion site itself.
Well, firefighters have to get close. They can't do their job otherwise. They take the risk, and that's what we pay them for. But in terms of risk to life among the firefighting crews, it's much more a case of extreme discomfort, unless, of course, there's another explosion. But I think we're beyond that by now. We're into the stage of containing the fire.
Okay, you mentioned 150,000 tonnes of fuel there. What sort of fuel, and what does it supply?
Well, I gather, I'm not completely familiar with the Buncefield site myself, but it's a mixture of all kinds of fuels. They keep petrol there, diesel fuel, aviation fuel to feed Heathrow and other airports. But this will have started, I imagine, as a petrol fire, because petrol is by far the most dangerous of the fuels they keep on site.
We read that it's, I think, the 5th largest fuel depot in the country.
That's right.
What sort of impact is this going to have on fuel for motorists and indeed for the aviation industry?
Not a lot is the answer. There may be a temporary glitch, but Buncefield, all right, it's the 5th largest, but of course there are 4 larger ones. There are also a couple of hundred slightly smaller ones scattered all over the country. The supply network is just that, it's a network. You can cut one link in the mesh and it still goes on working by and large.
These are just the latest live pictures that we're getting coming in. We're not, this is obviously, I think, from a fixed position. From, it looks like a skyscraper or a tall building, maybe a couple of miles away. Our helicopter has gone off to refuel, but you can see that the fire is still burning extremely fiercely, and that smoke obviously rising up. In fact, it's, I think, from the one of the masts which one of our satellite trucks can put up and mount a camera at the top there, just to give you some height and that sense of quite how far that smoke is rising up at the moment. We were talking about how to contain a fire like this. Jeff Daniels in the studio with me, an oil expert and a fuel engineer as well. What sort of materials will they be using to contain this? I mean, presumably you can't just throw water at it.
Water is no good at all except for cooling down things that haven't blown yet. The only thing that you can really seriously tackle fire with is foam. They'll be putting foam on and around that fire as far as they possibly can. But once you've got a fire of this extent, and looking at the pictures, it appears that a large part of the site is now ablaze. You're not going to put it out in conventional terms. All you can do is contain it, cut off the supply, and wait for it to run out of fuel, basically.
Police, interesting that you should say that, police are now saying that they believe half the depot is now on fire.
Yeah.
And we did see that some fire teams were trying to hose down the other tanks in the area, but presumably if that fire spreads and they cannot contain it, they will just have to withdraw.
Well, the police, I gather, have already warned that there may be 2 or 3 more explosions before we're finished with this thing, and they will be the tanks closest to existing flames, the tanks that are most at risk, the ones they think they may not be able to save.
Yeah, the latest report is, as I said, that the police said the depot was divided into 2 halves. One half has been destroyed. We've seen some of those tightly focused pictures quite where that is. A spokesman for the Health and Safety Executive said it was monitoring the explosions, investigating the incident, but at the moment the emergency service is taking the lead. The site must be made safe before we can send our investigators in. Jeff, you have a lifetime's experience of the fuel industry, the oil industry. How big a fire is this compared with what you've ever experienced before?
I was telling one of your colleagues earlier on that on an industry scale of disaster 0 to 10, I reckon this rates a 7 at least. It's the biggest fire in the UK since the Milford Haven refinery fire, which is what, a quarter of a century ago, there or thereabouts.
It operates 24 hours a day. We've been speaking to tanker drivers who were going in just to wait to pick up their trucks and get their loads and things. How tight, I mean, when one thinks about so much fuel there, just describe the sort of precautions that take place in a depot like this to avoid a disaster like something like this?
Well, there are 3 things to avoid. The first, of course, is leaks, because this will have started with a leak somewhere. This will have been probably petrol spilling out into an open place and vaporising. You try and avoid that at all costs. You also install instruments that ought to pick up any major leak. One of the things the inquiry, I imagine, will look at is what went wrong, because it appears that something went wrong with the monitoring equipment on site that should have detected what was happening. The second thing you do is guard against sparks, because you can't have an explosion without a spark to set it off. Normally when you go onto a site like this, you are required, for instance, to wear anti-static shoes and anti-static coats, that sort of thing. And of course, it goes without saying, you are searched, and I mean literally searched, for matches and cigarette lighters. It is, and the third thing, of course, is normally any site like this is subdivided. You know, each tank will sit in its own little clearing with earth walls around it, which should stop a fire in one tank from spreading to another.
You mention earth walls, but just from what we have seen from our helicopter shots here, I mean, that hasn't been apparent actually.
It's very difficult to tell, looking at that much smoke and that much flame. It's very difficult to sort out the infrastructure. There should have been been some way of isolating a fire in one tank from any of the others. But the explosion was obviously so violent that it literally jumped the defences and set several fires going at the same time. It certainly was a huge explosion. It woke me up in Wimbledon this morning. It's 25 miles away as the crow flies. Whatever event triggered this whole thing, it was a massive explosion which must have arisen originally from a big pocket of fuel vapour which would have been sitting there and getting more and more serious for hours before something triggered a spark and set the whole thing off.
And the shockwaves from those initial explosions, as we've been seeing from our helicopter position here. Just to point out to viewers, these pictures were taken about 10-15 minutes ago, so they're not live, but the fire is still burning almost as fiercely as when it first started. But just talking about the shockwaves, Jeff, you can see how it's misshapen some of the surrounding tanks.
The tanks there on the right-hand side,
as it's gone over. Just on the point of safety and the precautions, I read that this site first opened in 1968. Have things changed very much when it comes to safety procedures since then?
Not an awful lot. I mean, there are continual reviews, people continually tighten up, but any large depot like this will be regularly worked over and the latest safety recommendations will be implemented. Unfortunately, no matter how many pages you put into the rule book, once every quarter century or half century, you are going to get some kind of disaster on this scale. You just cannot be 100% proof against something like this happening.
Okay, Jeff Daniels, for the moment, thank you very much indeed for all your knowledge and expertise on the situation, which is still an ongoing situation at Hemel Hempstead. This fire, this huge fire, sending miles of thick black smoke into the atmosphere, continuing. Just to remind you, if you've just joined us, the explosions first happened at 6:03 this morning. Miraculously, just 39 people injured in this fuel depot explosion, and only a few of them seriously. No fatalities, according to police at the moment. Hertfordshire Police have been holding a news conference a little earlier this morning, and this is what was said.
In terms of the facts, what we know is that emergency services were contacted at 6:05 this morning by members of the public following reports of a huge explosion at the terminal. All indications at this stage are that this was an accident. However, clearly we will keep an open mind, as with all investigations, until we can confirm that for certain. We currently have around 100 police officers working at the scene, with higher numbers of fire service personnel also at the scene. As a result of the operation at the scene, we are anticipating that there will be further explosions during the morning, and we want to reassure the public that that is nothing untoward and is now expected. In terms of the site itself, there were a number of staff at the site at the time of the accident, and work is clearly still being undertaken to assess and collate information about their status. However, at this stage, we believe there are around 36 casualties, and I would emphasise that the vast majority of these are not serious injuries and are being treated at local hospitals. We think at the moment about 4 people are more seriously injured. If people have concerns about family members or friends, we have set up a casualty bureau number, and that number is 0800 096 0095. If I could repeat that, it's 0800 096 0095. There is also an overseas number on 0207 158 0125. And again, if I can repeat that, 0207 158 0125, obviously for anybody living abroad with concerns. As things stand at the moment, there is a plume of smoke above the site. There are light winds blowing from the west, and the plume is moving very slowly eastwards. This cloud, not least because it contains heavy smoke, is an irritant and will certainly make people who inhale it potentially cough, potentially irritate their eyes, and potentially feel nauseous. Our very strong advice is that people must keep out of the plume of smoke, and if the windows of your house have been blown out or are damaged, then we would suggest that you should evacuate yourself to somewhere safer.
Well, that was Chief Constable Frank Whiteley from Hertfordshire Police. Just to let you know that in a couple of minutes' time we will be back live at the scene with my colleague Chris Eakin, who is about a mile away from that fire which is still raging. Before we go to him, let's